Good morning, everyone. This is Leslie Wyatt with SoftPro, and welcome to episode 57 of Saved You a Seat. Today, we are going to talk about the effects of the NAR settlement. I'm sure everybody has at least heard of it or bits and pieces. So we went ahead and bought what we would consider for sure our expert on it, Brooklee Han, who is a real estate reporter from HousingWire, and I'm going to turn it over to her here in a minute after we do a few housekeeping things. Per usual, we do record every webinar, and you will receive an email later this week with a link to the recording if you want to use it internally or re-listen to it, because I'm sure it's going to have some great information, so feel free. We also encourage some interaction. If you guys have some questions, go ahead and use that question feature. We'll try and get to as many as we can. If by chance we don't get to yours, we'll certainly reach out offline or whatnot. Brooklee is really generous with her time today, so take advantage of it, of course. If you have a good question, please feel free to ask. I will say this is probably one of the few times, usually I tell everyone, hey, if it's real specific to you and your region, maybe we can't answer it on this webinar, but as Brooklee is going to talk about, this particular case kind of impacts the country a little bit different depending on the region and where you do business. So I'll let her get into that, but you can certainly ask questions that we will try and answer. And with that, I want to remind everybody that we are celebrating here at SoftPro our 40th anniversary, if you can believe it or not. So first and foremost, we want to thank all of our customers. We would not be here without you. We recognize how great you all are and that you have a choice and you've chosen us for the past 40 years, and we really appreciate that. We have a lot of fun giveaways. We're doing events and raffles throughout the whole year. So if you haven't already, go ahead and log on to www.softprocorp.com/40th anniversary. This will also be in that recording link, but go ahead and see what's going on and register and let us know if you have any questions or thoughts. So again, I really just want to thank you guys for choosing us and partnering with us in your business and everything you do day to day. So I'm going to stop talking here. I'm going to pop this over to Brooklee. Like I mentioned, Brooklee Han is a real estate reporter at the HousingWire, which we all love and definitely use as a resource in our industry. And we don't want to assume that because we've been submerged into the NAR settlement for God knows how long now that everyone else is as knowledgeable on it or has been following along. So I think quickly, if you don't mind kind of starting off by just a little bit of backtracking and story as to how it got started and where we got and how we got to where we are, and then maybe just go ahead with some of the information that you have, and then maybe we could take some questions. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to chat with everyone today. So the NAR settlement is a nationwide settlement of the commission lawsuits, which really started over 5 years ago now, with the first two original lawsuits being the Sitzer-Burnett and the Morrill suits, which were filed by home sellers in Missouri and Illinois back in 2019. The defendants in those two lawsuits included the National Association of Realtors, as well as 4 corporate brokerage defendants, which were Anywhere, RE/MAX, Keller Williams, and Home Services of America. The home seller plaintiffs in those lawsuits were alleging that the real estate industry players were colluding to artificially inflate real estate agent commissions. And at the center of this was NAR's participation rule, which required listing brokers to make a blanket offer of compensation to buyers brokers in order to list a property on a realtor association affiliated multiple listing service. So this lawsuit kind of progressed through the court for a number of years, and then in September of 2023, so exactly a year ago, both RE/MAX and Anywhere settled both the Sitzer-Burnett and the Morrill lawsuits together. Prior to the suit going to trial in mid-October. The suit eventually did go to trial, the Sitzer-Burnett suit, and a jury in Kansas City, Missouri on Halloween of last year found that NAR, Keller Williams, and Home Services of America were liable for colluding to artificially inflate agent commissions. In the ensuing days and months after the trial, after the jury verdict, several other copycat lawsuits were filed across the country. These lawsuits named some of the same plaintiff or some of the same defendants, both National Association of Realtors, Keller Williams, Home Service of America, as well as other brokerage and corporate brokerage defendants, and some state and local realtor associations or MLSs as well. So companies that found themselves all of a sudden in the middle of these lawsuits were Compass, EXP, Redfin, companies like that. And then, on February 1st of this year, Keller Williams was the next corporate brokerage defendant to reach a nationwide settlement. And then about a month and a half later, on March 15th, the National Association of Realtors announced that it had reached a nationwide settlement of all of the commission lawsuits, which, was at that point, obviously, Sitzer, Burnett, Morrill, and then several others that they had been named in after the jury verdict had come through. In that settlement, NAR agreed to pay $418 million into a settlement fund, and they also agreed to a variety of business practice changes, which included things like agents are no longer allowed to list offers of cooperative compensation on the MLS, and they're also not allowed to create or facilitate non-MLS mechanisms for sellers to make those blanket offers of compensation. That all agents working with buyers must enter into a written buyer-broker agreement prior to touring a home with a buyer. And these business practice changes were implemented kind of a bit sporadically across the country, but there was a mandate that they had to be in place by August 17th, 2024. So we saw some jurisdictions and states implement them, as early as end of June of this year. Others, waited till that August 17th deadline. After the NAR settlement, Home Service of America also settled. So all of the parties in the original two lawsuits have settled. And then in the kind of ensuing months after, we've seen settlements from Compass, the Real Brokerages, At Properties, Realty One Group, Home Services of America, Redfin, United Real Estate, HomeSmart, the Keys Company, which is a small independent brokerage in Florida, and Douglas Elliman. The settlements for Anywhere, Remax, and Keller Williams, which were the first three that were reached, were granted final approval by the court back in May of this year. The final approval hearing for all of the other brokerages besides Home Services of America, the hearing for that is set for October 31st, Halloween of this year. And then Home Services of America and the National Association of Realtors still have their final approval hearing for their settlements, which is set for November 26th of this year. So even though these business practices are in place now, all these changes have been made, we still are, unsure of if this settlement will be granted final approval. I think a lot of people in the industry are feeling confident that it will. It was granted preliminary approval back in April of this year, which was a really big first step. But still, this saga is definitely not over. There's also concern that the Department of Justice may look to get involved in the settlement, which I think a lot of people are looking at and not necessarily expecting, but thinking may happen moving forward, as the DOJ has gotten involved in the No Select Commission lawsuit, which did not name the National Association of Realtors as a defendant. But the DOJ has made it very clear that they don't want to see offers of cooperative compensation or buyer broker compensation anywhere. So it's, obviously we're waiting to see basically if the DOJ feels that the steps taken in the business practice changes outlined in the settlement have taken things far enough, or if they decide to file an amicus brief in the suit. But that being said, Judge Boo, who is overseeing the final approval of the settlements, he oversaw the Sitzer Burnett trial. He, does not have to agree with what the DOJ decides to say if it does decide to say something. So, it's kind of a waiting game at this point, but November 26th is definitely a big deadline for the real estate industry.
Sorry about that. You know, how many times I've done this and I'm still remain muted all the time. So, all right. So thank you so much for recapping. It's good for everyone to hear and kind of understand when we got here. And just for your purpose, and I know you know this, almost all our customers are title agents, settlement attorneys. You know, they're on the closing end of things, but they work hand in hand with their partners, which are realtors, or some of them actually are part of real estate firms. And so while this is not so much directly related to title, it does impact us in our industry as a whole and our customers. So just real quick, you mentioned waiting for final approval. I don't think a lot of people realize that because of that August date where the buyer's form specifically went into effect. So what kind of impact do you think that would have if they didn't stick with it? I personally, from my limited knowledge of it, don't see why they wouldn't approve it. But I don't know what your thoughts are, what you've heard as far as, you know, you mentioned that they should likely would approve it, but what would happen if they don't? Where would everything stand?
As far as my understanding of things, what would happen is the business practice changes that are currently in place would stay in place, but the parties would have to go back to the negotiation table. And part of it might be that they don't like the dollar amount, the 418 million. Maybe they think, you know, the judge feels like it should be more money than that, or it should be less money than that. Or maybe, you know, the DOJ does decide to say something and the court rules that they would like to see, you know, larger, more impactful business practice changes, you know, reflecting that, you know, no offers of cooperative compensation seen anywhere. So, you know, it would just kind of be back to the drawing board a little bit. I don't see a world in which the business practice changes that have gone in place get walked back at all. I could see them being progressed forward in a way that makes them a little bit more severe or stringent, I guess. But, you know, I think everyone feels pretty confident that those business practice changes will go into place, or that the business practice changes will stay and that the settlement will receive final approval. But if it even if it does receive final approval, as we've seen with both the Anywhere, the Remax, and the Keller Williams settlements, you know, they're still subject to appeals. Different parties can appeal those settlements, and you know, that obviously kind of slows down the process as well. And you know, the judge will then have to kind of rule on those appeals as well.
Interesting. Yeah, just for purposes of people who maybe aren't as immersed in it as you are, you've mentioned the DOJ, and I know that, you know, the DOJ, for lack of a better word, has been trying to audit NAR for 10 plus years and trying to get them to release a lot of their records and whatnot. And I know that when this ruling came out, they kind of jumped on and this again to kind of pick up where they left off, if you will. Do you have any insight on that, or kind of like real quick overview? Because I'm sure a lot of people don't really know that the Department of Justice has an interest in this and why.
Yeah, so that's kind of been a back and forth saga for probably longer even than I've been alive, with the DOJ going back and forth with the National Association of Realtors. Back in 2019, I think, the DOJ filed a CID with the National Association of Realtors looking for information on its clear cooperation policy, which does encompass the participation rule. They kind of reached a settlement on what they were going to change. And in that letter, basically the DOJ agreed to not reopen the investigation into the National Association of Realtors. There was then a change, obviously, of administration. And under the Biden administration, the DOJ did decide to reopen that investigation into the National Association of Realtors. And that the National Association of Realtors then filed a lawsuit, and they kind of were going back and forth over the DOJ's right to reopen this investigation into NAR. because of this settlement or this letter kind of at the center of all of this, in which they agreed not to. And that is why back in late September of last year, we saw the Department of Justice get involved in the No Select lawsuit. The claims in that lawsuit are exactly the same as the ones made in Sitzer Burnett, Morrill, all the other commission lawsuits, except the National Association of Realtors was not a party in that lawsuit. And in February of this year, the Department of Justice filed an amicus brief in that lawsuit calling for an end to cooperative compensation. And that kind of really, it showed the DOJ's view on all of this. And obviously the DOJ and the judge in that lawsuit, Patty Bisaris, have kind of gone back and forth, as well as the other parties involved in that suit, kind of trying to find a happy medium ground for everyone. But the DOJ has kind of used that lawsuit as its way of making its views known on these issues. In the ensuing months with kind of the legal battle between the DOJ and NAR, we first had, a court rule that they couldn't reopen the investigation, and then an appeals court ruled that, in fact, the DOJ was allowed to reopen this investigation. And the National Association of Realtors, after asking for a rehearing by the appeals court and having that motion dismissed, said they are potentially looking at appealing this decision to the Supreme Court with a writ of certiorari. It will remain to be seen if the Supreme Court wants to even hear or look at the appeal in that decision. But for the moment, the DOJ is allowed to, kind of reopen its investigation and continue looking into NAR and the clear cooperation policy based on the current kind of court ruling, or the appeals court ruling. So it's been a bit of a back and forth battle. And, once that appeals court ruling came through, that's when a lot of people became rather uncertain of what the DOJ might decide to do with Sitzer Burnett or Morrill. Instead of just kind of making its views known in the No Select suit.
Gosh, so much information, so interesting to follow along. We kind of started out, I mentioned, that this might have an impact depending on where you do business and how you do business, because, we all know we're all famous for it. Well, that's not how we do it here. So I'm sure, you travel the country, I travel the country, we hear it all the time. And they're right, they do it different. Some states, I'll use, Ellen's from Ohio. Southern Ohio and Northern Ohio do it completely different as far as commissions and such. So wondering what your thoughts are, or what you've seen while covering this topic throughout the country, as far as, which geographic areas might see the most impact and which ones maybe see the least, just kind of in what you've seen, your own eyes, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So, kind of the two major changes at the center of the NAR settlement are this requirement for having a signed buyer broker representation agreement or buyer agency agreement, and then also the removal of offers of cooperative compensation from the MLS. So obviously there were some markets, some states, even some agents who had the practice themselves, even if it wasn't required by government or their state associations, to have these buyer broker agreements signed, just so they had an insurance policy in case for whatever reason the seller wasn't offering cooperative compensation, because obviously those commissions have always been negotiable, and sellers have always had the option to not offer cooperative compensation. So some agents already had those practices in place, and the requirement to have them isn't really a big deal. They know how to articulate their value proposition. They know how to, make their consumer or their clients and their buyers comfortable with signing that buyer rep agreement. Typically, those weren't always signed, right at the start of the relationship or prior to that first home tour. Now, of course, it is mandatory to have it signed before that first home tour. So agents honestly, it differs, I think, from brokerage to brokerage. I'll talk to agents in the same geographic area, and they're approaching it differently. But some are jumping right to that exclusive buyer rep agreement. Others are kind of getting things going with a showing agreement that might just last a week or something like that, where they're just agreeing to show that client homes. And then others might do a non-exclusive buyer representation agreement before jumping kind of into that exclusive relationship. A lot of people are talking about this as kind of like a dating analogy, basically, and kind of having that conversation, not right away, but maybe a couple of house tours in, and deciding to have that exclusive relationship, because the buyer doesn't know if you're the right agent for them necessarily, and the agent doesn't know that if they really want to have that long-term relationship with that buyer. And so it goes both ways. And so we're seeing that differ from even brokerage to brokerage within the same kind of locality. The other big change, as I said, was kind of removing these offers of compensation from the MLS. And different brokerages are handling this very differently. Some brokers and brokerages and agents are still engaging in cooperative compensation if their seller is willing to, and charging a 5 or 6 or whatever percentage commission that they negotiate, and then splitting that commission in half with the buyer's broker. Others are only negotiating for their portion of the commission, and then the seller can either voluntarily offer a certain percentage or a certain dollar amount, and offer that to the buy side at the get-go, or they can just negotiate the sell side commission and then take a wait and see approach and see what the buyers and the buyer broker are going to potentially ask for in their offer. And some of these brokers are choosing to advertise either their cooperative compensation or what their seller is offering as buyer broker compensation on their personal websites or on social media or on the listing yard sign. Others are putting it on lock boxes, I've seen. It's differing from place to place. Others are not advertising that information at all, but are willing to give that information out if a buyer's broker calls them and asks, is your seller offering buyer broker compensation? And then others are choosing, maybe their sellers are also choosing as well to, not advertise that information at all, not share that information at all, and just tell buyers and their brokers that, their seller is willing to consider all offers, submit anything, ask for whatever you want to ask for, if it's buyer representation, if it's the patio furniture out back, if it's to leave the washer and dryer, ask for it, and we'll see, and we'll negotiate for those terms and figure out what works best for both sides and see if we can make a deal happen. And so again, that's differing, from brokerage to brokerage within the same region. And that is creating a bit of friction because people are taking different approaches to this. Obviously, it hasn't even been a full month yet since these business practice changes went into effect. So, I'm sure a best practice or, something resembling a best practice, at least, state to state, will emerge. It might differ state to state, kind of what the best practice is that emerges. So we'll wait and see what happens with that. The other big question is kind of how would consumers react to this? Obviously, as we all know, as professionals in the industry, those commissions have always been negotiable. But I think now consumers are even more abundantly clear of that fact. So we're definitely seeing an increase of those negotiations. There was a report put out by Redfin yesterday that said that negotiations with commissions are happening more frequently. Unfortunately, because commission data is no longer publicly available or easily available in the MLS, it is hard to track if commissions are going up and down. I think a lot of people do expect some commission compression in general. But anecdotally, I've heard both sides. In some of those markets that are a bit cooler, there's less buyer demand. sellers, it sounds like, are more willing to offer buyer broker compensation, just because they want to incentivize buyers to look at their house, and if there's 3 or 4 other properties in the same neighborhood at the same price point, kind of in the similar condition, they want to make their property stand out somehow. And buyers, because they've signed that buyer rep agreement, are more acutely aware now that they might be on the hook to pay for their buyer representation. So that's definitely a potential incentive for those buyers to kind of maybe more seriously look at that property over another. And then in warmer markets, I've heard anecdotally that some sellers are maybe less willing to offer compensation, or maybe not offering 2% or 2.5% as they might have done previously, but going a little bit less, and then possibly negotiating with the buyer and the buyer broker in the offer to maybe the buyer increases their offer amount, and so they're willing to kind of make that dollar amount work for the buyer broker compensation, because the seller still walks away with the net that they wanted to achieve. So we're seeing some shifts with that, and from the stories I have heard, it doesn't sound like sellers who are doing that are at all struggling in those hotter markets to sell their houses. But again, it's still early, so we're still kind of waiting to see what the potential, the full ramifications of this might be.
Yeah, you touched on a couple of things that I had talked to someone about before too, and one is which is the consumers, both buyers and sellers traditionally have kind of just done what was ever expected or how they were supposed to do it in the market, right? We know you could negotiate a commission, we know you could do this and that, but most people really didn't, right? They buy 1, 2, at most 3 houses in their lifetimes in the past, and they just kind of rely on the professionals. But now you have a much smarter consumer, a much more educated consumer, from various reasons, but over the past 10 years with the inception of the CFPB, and then you have this now NAR settlement, and you have more transparency in forms. The buyers and sellers both realize that they are both consumers now, and they have a right and a choice to whom they work with and how they go about it. So some of your examples were super interesting, and I've said this before, at the end of all of this, the seller has a bottom line, and how they get to it, they honestly don't care, right? So whether it's a 5% that goes all to the seller's agent, or that seller's agent agrees to split it, that's really kind of between the two agents now, and the seller is kind of removed. They are just going to pay what they're going to pay. I hadn't really so much thought about the buyer's agents writing it into a contract, which, I mean, I guess I had, but that's very interesting too. Almost like, hey, leave your refrigerator and pay me 2.4%. It's a different mindset, but it's kind of the same end game. But I think it's very interesting that they're advertising it basically everywhere and anywhere other than the MLS, because that's really, the place that they say you can. And for those of you that maybe aren't 100% sure as to why that is it's really just saying, oh, if an agent sees 3 houses and 2 are giving a $2,000 bonus or a higher split, they may try and steer consumers to those because they have a higher commission. Not saying they would, but that's the mindset of it. So by removing that, it puts everyone on a level playing field. Obviously, there's a million ways around it, as you just said. The lock boxes are pretty wild to me, but it's very interesting to hear, because it's kind of just a shift in this is how we do it here. When you were first talking, you were saying that like it's kind of now like them, that they'll just know, okay, the seller is going to give you say 5 or 6%, but we know we're going to get that in the contract. So I'm going to have this buyer agent or buyer sign this form, but I'm like, the buyer knows I'm not going to have to pay it. So I mean, I think I asked you geographically, but I think to your point, it really is a shift for everybody, and we're going to see it play out differently until, like you said, state by state, they might make some changes and some rules and regs behind that. So that's really interesting information, and it led me to we did have 2 questions that I'll ask, and then I have some more, but one of which is somebody asked, is this going to be and I can answer this, but I'll let you, the buyer's form going to be a standardized form, or is it something that each real estate agent or brokerage will have to do. And essentially, you already answered that. It's until the states get involved, or their local associations, it's probably going to vary. But I'm going to throw that to you to get your input.
Yeah, absolutely. So some state realtor associations have provided forms to their members, as they have always done. Some of the brokerages in a given state don't want to use those particular forms because maybe it does still talk about cooperative compensation, or the fact that those state forms were created by a board that includes executives from all the major brokerages in the state or the region. They're concerned that by using those forms, by partaking in those things, they could be called out for potential collusion. So they aren't using those forms, especially if they do call for cooperative compensation. If they don't talk about cooperative compensation and the commissions are fully divided between, this is the seller and what the seller's agent is making, and then this is the buyer's agent, and this is what the buyer's agent would possibly make, they're more likely to use that. From the conversations I've had with folks, we have seen some brokerages promulgate their own forms. EXP has created their own forms. Some of the small brokerages as well have decided to do that. Up in my area, Lamakia Realty, which operates throughout New England as well as a little bit in Florida, they have created their own forms. So some brokerages have decided to kind of go that direction. We've also seen MLSs and state realtor associations put out forms, and then a week or two later go, oh wait, hold on, let's use these ones instead. So everyone's kind of figuring this out as they go along. And I think everyone's kind of in an even playing field because they are kind of all figuring it out together. And also, as I said, with those best practices, I think different brokerages, different agents are going to try on different models possibly, and try on different ways of doing things moving forward until they figure out what works best for them and what they're having the most success with their clients. So I think, yeah, it's just going to be a little bit of chaos for a while as everyone kind of figures out what they like best and how it's works best for them, and then we'll start to see some more patterns emerge, and hopefully a little bit of an end to the chaos.
Yeah, a follow-up question to that, and I can answer this, is someone asked, should we start asking for this form at closing? And quite honestly, unless it's part of the lender instructions, no, it has nothing to do with the settlement agent. At that point, that's between the buyer and the buyer's agent and the selling agent and the brokerage firm. So until there's a direction that at closing, this needs to be a provided form, or a lender wants it in their package, I don't think to answer the question, no, our end of it doesn't need to start asking for that all of a sudden. So picking up where we had left off, and we were talking about this form, I've heard a lot of chatter saying this is going to drive especially part-time buyer's agents out of the industry, and maybe even more also buyer's agent, and push maybe some people who specialize in mostly buyers and not listings to maybe try and become listing agents, or it's going to kind of push out the middle to small sized ones, because the larger agents can overcome this no matter what, right? They've got teams, they can act as buying and selling, stuff like that. And the reason why the question comes up a lot is because as a buyer might not want to sit down and sign a form that says at some point somebody's going to pay me 2% or 3%, whether it be you, the selling agent, or the seller, or whatnot. They may not want to sign that, so they might want to go directly to a seller to avoid that. And also, or listing agent, sorry. And also along those lines, that they might feel that they have a better negotiating power if they're saying, hey, we'll cut this agent out, and you can, instead of paying that agent, you can reduce the price. So have you heard this, or what are your thoughts on, like, the traditional kind of part-time weekend buyer's agent or smaller buyer's agents, and where their place is in the market post the NAR settlement?
I think there definitely has been a lot of talk, as you said, about some of those part-time agents or less kind of career professional agents leaving the business. I think we've seen a lot of them already leave when the market slowed down back in 2022. And, I think obviously if you're more of a hobbyist at this, these are some massive changes that you might have to deal with. And, that alone is frustrating enough. And then, there's concern that, you might not be able to, do business or make the same amount of money doing business. And then you have to start looking at, is it worth the investment in, doing those CEs, doing, all your memberships that you have to maintain, and any fees that you might have to, pay to your brokerage, just to, kind of be brokered there. So I think, yeah, we are going to see a decrease in the number of agents, especially those part-time and hobbyist agents. But I think any agent, regardless of, if they do this more as like a side gig or as their kind of professional thing, if they really put their mind to it and, decide to commit to this, they would be able to successfully navigate these changes. And, that same goes for newer agents entering the business as well. I don't think we're going to all of a sudden see no one decide that they want to be a real estate agent. But yes, there is concern obviously about, commissions going down, especially on the buy side. And, again, concerns about unrepresented buyers, people going directly to listing agents. As of 2023, I think it was 89% of buyers use real estate agents. So, that we'll see if that statistic changes at all. It has been going up in recent years. And I think in, some of these hotter markets, buyers want that help. First-time buyers, typically do want that help as well. But, those buyer rep agreements definitely kind of are a bit of a barricade, between the buyer and the buyer's agent. And one of the things that I've heard a lot about is that some of these agents are just like almost paranoid about getting these forms signed. And so they're kind of going into that first interaction with the buyer, almost forgetting that they need to, earn their trust and win their business before asking them to, sign this document and, potentially pay them, 2 or 3% or whatever percent they negotiate of the sale price of the home. And if the first thing you do is shove that agreement in a consumer's face, they're probably going to run away and then go find another agent and be like, they just wanted me to sign this thing right away. And so that's the story I'm hearing frequently. And so because of that, we're seeing, usage of these things like a showing agreement or a touring agreement, or, some of these short-term or non-exclusive buyer representation agreements, just that, that make consumers feel a little bit more comfortable about signing something. So the agent can still be in compliance with the terms of the NAR settlement, but also that, the consumer feels comfortable in the situation. So, I think that's something that we're seeing a bit more of. And then, agents who are good at kind of earning consumers' trust and articulating their value proposition and, really kind of walking the buyer through this process and making them comfortable enough to, sign one of these forms. Those are the agents that are going to be successful moving forward.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. In the conversation I was having with someone, that's exactly what I said. I said, it's an opportunity for a buyer's agent to explain not only the value but benefit of having a buyer's agent and highlight what it is you do versus just, I show someone a house. It's the whole process. So it's just like any other sales and marketing, in my opinion. And yes, it might be a little bit different, but to your point, I think some of them are that's not something they're used to having to sign up front as far as having a monetary value tied to a buyer's agent agreement. So I think you're right. I think that, the market itself slowed down and kind of weeded out some potential maybe part-time ones, but that this is an opportunity for buyer's agents to kind of really sell themselves as far as their value and what they do and what they have to offer, and the fact that they're really the only one at the table representing that borrower. So I do agree with that. But I do want to clarify, we had someone say that they maybe misunderstood something I said as far as when someone said, do we need to start asking for that buyer's agreement? I mean, you didn't need to ask for it. Like, you don't need to prove that they have that in place. That's between the broker, the agent, and the buyer. As far as whatever the compensation that they agree on, which really doesn't actually have anything to do with the buyer's agreement, because that could change per the contract, you would still, of course, get that information, so you know who to pay on your closing disclosure or whichever settlement statement. The question was more, do we need to be like, policing that someone has had this signed? And that is not your job. Obviously, that's the broker at the real estate. So,
Yeah,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
oh, the MLSs are the ones that have been tasked with enforcing a lot of these things. So
Yeah.
that's kind of where the compliance side of it all is.
Perfect. Question to you regarding what your thoughts are now that you have maybe a more informed or educated seller. Let's talk about the seller here for a second. Do you see them saying, I don't really need the traditional agent anymore. I'm going to go with some of these online platforms where I'm only having to pay 1 or 2%. It's not my problem how the buyer's agent gets paid. And I know this now because of everything that we've been, dealing with over the past year or so with NAR. Some people seem to think that this is not only going to have a direct impact on that buyer side, but also that sellers, the consumer side of selling the property, that they're more likely to either negotiate a smaller commission, which they've always been able to, obviously. But do you see that some of them might shift to some of these more online, lower commission, flat fee commission rates? Do you think that this might push some of that there, or do you think there's the people that would use that will still normally use that, and people more traditional will use the seller's agent? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I think obviously sellers, consumers in general, are becoming a little bit more savvy about this whole process because it has been in the news so much. A lot of, we're seeing a ton of AI kind of agent platforms pop up, since the NAR settlement. I've spoken with like at least 5 of them, and I know there's several others out there. So far, most of those are not actually working on the seller side. They're only geared toward buyers, and the reasoning they have is just because of the compliance side of things and how many disclosures and things like that need to be dealt with on the sell side, that they don't feel the AI is sophisticated enough to deal with something like that just quite yet. Obviously they're developing it and working on it, but in terms of like AI platforms and things like that, I don't see that taking off anytime soon. I did speak with some of the big companies like HomeZoo and things that, like these mega agents that basically list properties on the MLS. That is all they do. They charge a flat fee for it. If you want other services like help with negotiations or professional photography or something like that, it's like an a la carte option that a seller could pay for. They're optimistic that this is kind of increased awareness of the cost of transacting real estate, which might drive some sellers to, something like that, like a HomeZoo. So, we'll see if that does happen. Anecdotally, as I said, heard stories in some of these really super hot markets with high buyer demand of sellers, offering a smaller buyer broker compensation or buyer broker commission, or sellers just waiting to see what the buyer asks for in the offer. So I think that obviously is a possibility of what sellers might do. I've heard some stories that sellers on the luxury side of the world are, maybe a little bit less willing to, offer compensation in light of all of this. I've heard others say that that's not true. So I think that might just depend on market. And at any price point, you're probably going to run across the seller who's been like, I saw this thing in the news and I'm not paying a buyer's broker anything. And that might happen. I've heard some folks that have run into, a situation like that. But real estate agents, as well as those on the lending partners that they have on the transaction, have found ways to kind of make it all come through and make it happen. So I think people are kind of getting creative and finding ways to make it work. But yeah, I think, we'll see how sellers continue to react to this. I think it'll depend on kind of the temperature of the market as well as the seller's kind of level of motivation to sell a property. And yeah, I think, we're still kind of in a wait and see mode. But I think really, more at that first time home buyer price point, I think sellers kind of understand, or at least somewhat understand, that, those first time or entry level buyers are struggling, even to possibly put together a down payment, and they might be more willing to kind of lend a helping hand, if you will, and, help cover some of that buyer broker compensation. And just get their home sold. And as we discussed, that net is really what matters to the buyer, or matters to the seller. And so a lot of listing agents that I've spoken with have pivoted to really focusing on that, and figuring out what that dollar amount is that the seller wants to walk away with, and then keeping that in mind as they kind of negotiate the sale and work through it all. And so the seller gets what they want, and ideally the buyer has a transaction and a cost for them that works out.
I could not agree more. I think a lot of this will settle itself out, just like it always has when there's been changes on the real estate side of things. It's just kind of, I think the most jarring thing for the buying side was I have to get a buyer to sign an agreement that says at some point I have to get paid. But, a lot of agents already had some form of this in there, right? Or, so this is not all like brand new. It's a chance, like we said, to really highlight how you do business and how beneficial you are to that buyer or to that seller. So, there's been some talk with there's been some chatter throughout the country and the various shows I've been at and the people I've talked to about the state real estate associations kind of separating themselves from NAR. And if you can correctly describe, I think part of the agreement was that, and again, you can correctly explain this, but there was something in the agreement or the ruling that came out that said that they don't have to be a member of NAR and the MLS, NAR's MLS. They can just simply use the state one. Do you see a time or place where the national multiple listing system is in more just owned and driven by the states, and that NAR is kind of not part of it? Or have you heard that kind of chatter as well?
Yes. So in most of the corporate brokerage settlement agreements that I've seen, obviously some of them, the terms have not been made public, but like RE/MAX, Keller Williams, and Anywhere, those all contain a stipulation that they will no longer require their agents and brokers to be members of the National Association of Realtors. And we saw Redfin about a year ago say that they were, if where it was possible, asking their agents and brokers to, let their NAR membership lapse. So, I think we're definitely expecting to see a decrease in NAR membership. We're also potentially expecting to see some states or local associations kind of decouple in a way from the National Association. Whereas, previously when you signed up for membership, it was for, a 3-in-1 or a 2-in-1 if you didn't have a local association. And now, separate it. So if you really just wanted to join your state association because you were, passionate about some of the things happening in your state and wanted to, support the Realtor Association as it kind of combats or works for some of those initiatives, you are more than welcome to do that. And yes, there has been some chatter about kind of the MLSs being separated from the Realtor Associations. We haven't seen any drastic action happen yet. That isn't to say it might not happen moving forward. We also have some really big MLSs in the country that blanket, more than one state, or, are in various parts of various different states. So, We'll see kind of how it all plays out. But that has definitely been talked about as a possibility, as well as a decrease in NAR membership, which we were already seeing kind of prior to all of this, as some of those agents left the industry due to the market slowdown.
Yeah, I mean, NAR is a very, very robust trade association, as you know, both them and the NBA are two of the largest. So it'll be interesting to see. Obviously, they can weather some dips in their membership, but it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. That was my personal question because I've heard the chatter about it, and I was like, I just don't see any immediate transition from it, but I, have seen, like you said, the Redfin. I knew about that and stuff. So just kind of interesting as to the different takes of it. And I also think some of that's going to be geographic, and I think also it's going to be how large the brokerage is too. To your point, you were saying some larger brokers are saying, because they can kind of run their own stuff, whereas a smaller broker generally needs that information and whatnot. So I am going to take this second to answer a question that is SoftPro specific, if you don't mind. Somebody had mentioned that they still do a lot of closings on a HUD-1 settlement, and they wanted to know if SoftPro was going to change the HUD-1 to allow commissions to be paid by buyers. I'm pretty sure there is already a way. We will have someone reach out and show you, but currently in the system, you can use a feature where you can zero out percentage paid by seller, and it should kick it to the buyer. But we are happy to show you how to do that, and I will have somebody reach out to you and explain that. So I just wanted to let you know we saw that, and we will have it. Another question we had here just simply said, the commission on the buyer's broker, they generally just issue a check. They want to know if they'll be directed as to when the buyer is paying versus the seller, and when it should be shown on the settlement statement. I'm going to go back to what we talked about already. Those are all things that are going to be, first of all, lender driven and NAR driven at this point, and state driven as far as what needs to show on the form and not. And I don't think we've gotten there. I can speak from our perspective because I work in the compliance department and we handle all the forms with the documents team. And we are just now starting to get some information from some, individual states on some verbiage they might want changed, but we're not getting any directive from, say, the CFPB or from HUD or from Fannie or Freddie as to what needs to be changed on some of the standardized federal closing documents. More or less just like on forms, we've had requests to change commissions to compensation. And while it's not required, some states are thinking about making it required. So going back to what Brooklee has said is this is kind of a fluid kind of rolling thing, and as things change and whether it gets approved or not, I think we're going to see some things formulate on a state basis like we do everything. And they'll take the nuts and bolts and they'll say, okay, here's what we have to do. And then they'll add here's what we want to do. And then that'll be your state guidelines. And your AG or your DOIs will issue those just like they do any changes that we do now. So just from our customer base, just so everyone knows, we are on top of it. We are talking with different states. But as far as HUD, your closing disclosure forms, we've had zero direction from any of those organizations that they are at a point where they're going to change the terminology, nor are they directing anyone to. So when we do, obviously you guys will be the first to know. I just wanted to answer that real quick. And then I was just wondering, because I know some people had mentioned this when I was talking about this with them one time. They were saying, do you think with a down market, and this is really just your personal opinion, so we won't hold you to it, but with a slower down market, which, I always have to say this, I know some of you are in the weeds rolling in the orders that are coming in, depending on where you are in the country. And I know some of you are just, waiting for the next order, because obviously we can't, every area is different. And the market is different within all those areas. But for the whole, as parts, 2020 to 2022 was astronomical, right? Everyone was busy. And then you have 23 and 24 slower, more stabilizing, actually, I would rather say, than slower. If you really want to compare your numbers and where the market's at, you have to go back to 2019. You really can't compare, record low historical interest rates, everybody at home, more disposable income to anything, because it's never applied. So 2019 to 2023, that's your apples to apples, if you will. So with that said, do you think, because sellers know that they technically don't have to pay that buyer's fee anymore, that buyer's commission, and that they can also negotiate, do you think in some markets, and maybe the ones that are being harder hit right now, that this will cause sellers to rethink their pricing and say, okay, well, I can come down in pricing because I don't have to pay as much, and maybe help bring housing pricing down, because the rates are not going to come down, much right now, and even if they do, it's going to be, minimal. Do you think that that might be a marketing tool that sellers or sellers agents might start using to help the areas maybe regenerate some business and growth in areas that it might be slow?
I think they might try, but I think it's a bit of a misguided strategy, because at the end of the day, that buyer broker still needs to get paid. And even if they go down, 10,000, 15,000 in the sale price or the list price, but say, we're not offering a penny of buyer broker compensation, that buyer is still having to provide that cash out of pocket then. And they might not have that cash on hand. And that would limit their buyer pool or potential buyer pool, even if they do drop that home price. So I don't think it will really drive down prices or have any impact on home prices at all. Where I'm hearing more about prices is, say a seller is only willing to offer 1% or 1.5%. So the buyer, instead of coming in at list price, comes in, a 20,000 over list price, but asks for that seller to cover a certain dollar amount that they've agreed on with their buyer broker for compensation. And then, having concerns about, whether or not that property would then appraise for that amount. So, while that is a strategy I've seen being taken in some markets, there definitely is kind of the concern of the appraisal and, will that drive up housing prices in the area? So, and because that information about what the commission is no longer available on the MLS, it's making it harder for some agents to do, their comparative market analysis and, possibly accurately price homes moving forward. So I don't really see it driving prices down at all.
I could not agree with you more. I think the misconception is that, oh, we'll lower the price, it'll bring in more buyers, but the reality is exactly what you just said. You're actually now going to limit your buyers, because especially in the first time home buyer market, it's, they're trying to get in with as little down. So if they're putting 3 to 5% down and now you've added, they've got to pay $7,000 in commission, they're not going to, they can't do that, right? So I also think it's a misguided marketing tool as well. But I know a lot of people have been asking, so I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. I think that's all the questions that we have. Ellen, you can tell me otherwise, but with that, Brooklee, I cannot thank you enough. This has been so interesting. I love hearing other people talk about it. You definitely are more involved and kind of throughout the country and have a really good background as to where it's headed and where it came from. So I hope everyone enjoyed Brooklee's insight today. And I hope we were able to get through your questions. So I think with that, I'm going to thank Brooklee one last time. I'm going to remind everybody that we are celebrating our 40th, and to go ahead and follow that link and see what we have in store for you guys and say thank you again. I'll remind you that we will send out a follow-up email, kind of, recapping what we did and then sending a link. And with that, I'm going to give you back your day, and we appreciate your time, both Brooklee and everybody on the phone, and we look forward to our next Save You a Seat. Thanks so much.
Thank you.